Imagine Earth 70,000 years ago. Not the crowded, noisy, interconnected planet we know today, but something else, something quiet, eerily quiet. The sun rises over the African savanna, but something's wrong. The sky has a strange colour, reddish grey, thick with particles that make breathing feel heavy. The temperature has dropped. Not winter cold, but wrong cold. Like the planet itself is sick. And across the entire continent, across the entire world, there are fewer than 10,000 humans left alive. Not 10 million, not 100,000, just 10,000 people, maybe less. Some estimates put it as low as 3,000 breeding pairs. That's it. The entire human population that could have fit inside a small college football stadium. Everyone who would ever exist, every person who would ever be born, every civilization that would ever rise, all hanging by the thinnest thread imaginable. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's wild, like Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching the same story about how we almost weren't here to watch anything at all. Today there are over 8 billion of us. We're everywhere, unstoppable, building cities that touch the clouds, sending robots to Mars, connecting every corner of the planet with invisible networks of information. We act like we own this place, like we've always been here and always will be. But 70,000 years ago, we were on the edge of extinction, not slowly declining, not gradually fading away. We were staring into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back. This is the story of the day humanity almost vanished. And you've probably never heard about it because it happened so long ago that it is almost impossible to imagine. But it happened. The evidence is written in your DNA, in volcanic rock scattered across continents, in the genetic signatures that scientists can trace like fingerprints from a crime scene where the victim barely survived. The culprit? A mountain in Indonesia that decided to explode with the force of several million nuclear bombs, Mount Toba. A name that should be as famous as the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. But most people have never heard of it. Yet what happened there 74,000 years ago was possibly the most catastrophic event in human history. Not recorded history, human history. The whole thing. Here's what we know. Toba wasn't just a volcano. It was a supervolcano. Something so massive that when it erupted, it didn't just affect the local area. It affected the entire planet. We're talking about an eruption 5,000 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. An explosion so violent it ejected 670 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. That's enough material to bury the entire state of Texas under 15 feet of debris. The eruption column reached 50 miles into the sky. 50 miles. That's twice as high as most weather occurs. Punched through the stratosphere and kept going, spewing sulfur dioxide and ash into the upper atmosphere, where it would stay for years, circling the globe, blocking out the sun. Within weeks, the ash cloud had spread across the entire planet. Temperatures dropped by 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. In some regions, they dropped even more. The world plunged into what scientists call a volcanic winter. 6 years of near darkness, of plants dying, of animals starving, of ecosystems collapsing like dominoes. And somewhere in Africa, small bands of early humans, your ancestors, my ancestors, looked up at the darkened sky and faced a simple choice. Adapt or die. Most chose poorly. Or rather, most didn't get to choose at all. They simply died. Quickly or slowly, from starvation, from cold, from the complete collapse of everything they'd relied on to survive. But a few, a tiny few, somehow made it through. And the evidence of their survival, their desperate struggle through the worst climate catastrophe humans have ever faced, is written in every cell of your body right now. See, when populations crash this severely, they leave genetic signatures. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a library with 100,000 different books. Now imagine a fire destroys 99% of them. You're left with only 1,000 books. Even if you later make copies of those 1,000 books until you have 100,000 again, they're all copies of the same 1,000. The diversity is gone forever. That's what happened to human genetic diversity. Scientists can look at our DNA today, all 8 billion of us, and see that we're remarkably similar. More similar than we should be. More similar than other species that have much smaller populations. Chimpanzees, who number maybe 300,000 in the wild, have far more genetic diversity than all humans combined. That's not normal. That's the signature of a bottleneck. A severe one. For decades, geneticists suspected something had happened in our past. Some event that had reduced human populations to dangerously low levels. But they didn't know what. They didn't know when. And they didn't know how close we'd come to complete extinction. Then they discovered Toba. Or rather, they discovered the layers of volcanic ash buried in ancient soil across Africa, across Asia, across the Middle East. Ash that dated to exactly the same time that the genetic bottleneck occurred. The pieces started falling into place. You know that feeling when you realise how close you came to disaster? Like when you miss a car accident by inches and your heart pounds and you think, that could have been it. That's what happened to our entire species. Except it wasn't a split second. It was years, decades, maybe centuries of barely hanging on while the planet itself seemed determined to kill us. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. The question that scientists are still trying to answer. How did we survive? What did those few thousand people have that the others didn't? Was it luck? Was it geography? Was it something about the way they thought? The way they cooperated? The way they refused to give up even when giving up would have been so much easier? The answers are buried in volcanic ash, written in genetic code, hidden in archaeological sites that are only now being properly understood. And what we're learning is more than just a story about survival. It's a story about what makes us human. About resilience, adaptation, and the stubborn refusal to accept extinction that's apparently coded into our species at the deepest level. Because we didn't just survive Toba, we went on to become the most successful large mammal on the planet. From fewer than 10,000 individuals scattered across Africa to 8 billion people covering every continent, from the edge of extinction to masters of the world. So how did we do it? Let's start at the beginning, before the sky turned dark, when our ancestors had no idea that everything was about to change forever. Let's travel back, way back, 74,000 years ago, before civilization, before agriculture, before recorded history, before humanity had any idea it was about to face the ultimate test. The world looked very different then, but in many ways it was also strikingly familiar. Africa, the birthplace of humanity, was a mosaic of environments that would take your breath away. The savannas stretched endlessly, golden grasslands dotted with acacia trees, their flat-topped crowns silhouetted against brilliant blue skies. During the wet season, these plains transformed into an explosion of life. Wildebeest migrations that made the Serengeti look sparse. Elephant herds numbering in the thousands, lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, all hunting the same abundant prey that human hunters depended on. The forests were different, but equally rich. Dense tropical rainforests covered much of Central Africa, their canopies so thick they created permanent twilight at ground level. Rivers carved through these green cathedrals, their banks teeming with hippos, crocodiles, and countless species of fish. For humans who knew how to read the forest, it was a pharmacy and supermarket combined. Fruits, nuts, roots, medicinal plants, all there for the taking if you had the knowledge. The coasts offered their own abundance. Shellfish beds that stretched for miles, tidal pools filled with trapped fish, seabird colonies where eggs could be harvested by the thousands during breeding season. Some human groups had already figured out that the ocean's edge was one of the most reliable food sources on the planet. You might go days without finding game on the savannah, but the tide came in twice a day, every day, bringing food with it. This was the world that cradled early Homo sapiens. Not quite paradise, but close enough. But here's what makes this period so fascinating. Humans weren't alone, not by a long shot. 74,000 years ago, the world was populated by at least 4 distinct human species, maybe more. Think about that. Multiple kinds of humans, all living on the same planet, all competing for the same resources, all trying to survive in a world that didn't care which of them made it. In Africa, Homo sapiens was still relatively new on the scene. Modern humans had emerged somewhere between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, depending on how you define modern. By 74,000 years ago, we'd been around long enough to spread across most of the African continent, but we were still evolving, still developing the traits that would eventually make us the dominant species. And we weren't even the biggest human population at the time. In Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals were absolutely thriving. They'd been around for at least 400,000 years, possibly longer. They were perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions, masters of their environment in ways that would have impressed any modern hunter. Neanderthal populations were robust, their territories well established, their survival strategies refined over hundreds of thousands of years. If you were a betting person 74,000 years ago, you might have put your money on Neanderthals being the human species most likely to succeed long term. They were stronger than Homo sapiens, better adapted to cold climates, and they had a proven track record of surviving through multiple Ice Age cycles. They weren't some primitive precursor to modern humans. They were sophisticated, intelligent, culturally complex apex predators. Further east, across Asia and into the Pacific, Denisovans were doing their own thing. We know less about them because they left fewer fossils, but genetic evidence tells us they were successful, adaptable, and widespread. They'd managed to colonize an enormous range of environments, from the Siberian tundra to tropical Southeast Asian islands. That takes serious survival skills. And then there was Homo erectus, the old-timer of the human family. Erectus had been around for nearly 2 million years. They'd been the first human species to leave Africa, the first to master fire, the first to develop sophisticated hunting strategies. By 74,000 years ago, they were mostly gone from the mainland, outcompeted by younger, more adaptable species. But isolated populations still survived on islands in Indonesia, including the population that would eventually evolve into the famous hobbits of Flora's Island. 4 human species, 4 different evolutionary paths, 4 separate survival strategies, all existing simultaneously on one planet. Now, some of these species occasionally encountered each other. When Homo sapiens began venturing out of Africa, probably in small exploratory groups testing the waters of migration, they would have run into Neanderthals in the Middle East. We know from genetic evidence that they sometimes interbred, but for the most part these species occupied different ecological niches, different territories, different worlds. Back in Africa, where most Homo sapiens lived, life was both simpler and more complex than you might imagine. Let's talk numbers first. How many humans were there? This is where it gets interesting and a little bit terrifying. The best estimates suggest that 74,000 years ago, the total human population across all species might have been somewhere between 1 and 10 million individuals. Maybe, possibly less. That's not a lot. The modern city of New York has more people than existed on the entire planet back then. For Homo sapiens specifically, we're probably talking about a few 100,000 individuals at most, and they weren't concentrated in cities or even large settlements. They were scattered across the African continent in small, isolated groups, separated by vast stretches of hostile terrain. A typical human band in this period would have numbered maybe 20 to 50 individuals. Extended family groups, basically. Grandparents, parents, children, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone you knew, everyone you would probably ever know in your entire life, living and travelling together. Multiple bands might share a general territory, what anthropologists call a tribe. Maybe 500 people total, spread across an area the size of a small country. You'd encounter other bands occasionally at seasonal gathering spots, water sources during the dry season, places where certain fruits ripened, areas where game naturally congregated. These meetings were crucial. They weren't just social events. They were how you found marriage partners outside your immediate family group, how you traded resources, stone for tools from one region, ochre for body paint from another, information about where the herds were moving, how you maintained relationships that could mean the difference between survival and starvation when times got tough. But most of the time, most bands were on their own. Small groups of humans moving through landscapes that could swallow them whole. Daily life was consumed by the constant search for food. Forget everything you think you know about the leisure of hunter-gatherer existence. That's mostly romantic nonsense, at least for this period. Life was hard work. The men typically were hunters, not every day and not always successfully. Hunting large game was dangerous, exhausting work. You might track an antelope for hours through the savannah heat, only to lose it. Or worse, attract the attention of lions who decided you looked like easier prey. A successful hunt, taking down something substantial like a zebra or a buffalo, was a big deal. Something to celebrate. Meat that would feed the whole band for days. But you couldn't count on big game, so hunters also pursued smaller prey. Rabbits, birds, lizards, anything they could catch with throwing sticks, simple spears, or increasingly sophisticated traps. Every calorie counted. The women, children, and older adults focused on gathering. This was actually where most of the calories came from, most of the time. They knew hundreds of plant species, which ones were edible, which were medicinal, which would kill you if you ate them wrong. They knew where to dig for tubers and roots, how to process toxic nuts to make them safe, when different fruits ripened, how to track bee colonies to their hives for honey. This knowledge was precious, accumulated over generations and passed down through stories, demonstrations, and hard experience. Lose that knowledge, lose someone who knew which mushrooms were safe, and people died. Everyone worked. Children as young as 5 or 6 contributed by collecting berries, catching insects, helping process food. By their teens, they were expected to master the survival skills they'd need as adults. There was no formal schooling, just constant observation and practice. Your education was watching your mother identify medicinal plants, while your father taught you to read animal tracks in the dust. Technology was simple but effective. Stone tools dominated, hand axes shaped from flint or obsidian, scrapers for processing hides, sharp flakes for cutting meat. Creating these tools was a skill that took years to master. You had to understand how different stones fractured, how to control your strikes to create the shape you needed, how to maintain your tools to keep them sharp and functional. Fire was perhaps the most important technology of all. Humans had mastered fire maybe 400,000 years ago, possibly earlier. By 74,000 years ago, every human group knew how to create and maintain it. Fire meant warmth on cold nights. It meant protection from predators. No lion or leopard would willingly approach a campfire. It meant cooked food, which was not only safer but provided more calories and nutrients than raw food. Your body could extract more energy from cooked meat and tubers than raw ones, meaning fire literally increased your food supply without requiring any additional hunting or gathering. Fire also meant community. Evening gatherings around the flames where stories were told, where knowledge was shared, where the day's events were discussed and plans were made for tomorrow, where children learned the oral history of their people, where elders passed down the survival wisdom that kept everyone alive. But don't romanticize it too much. Life expectancy was brutal. Most children didn't survive to adulthood. Infant mortality was probably around 40 to 50%. Disease, accidents, predators, malnutrition all took their toll. If you made it to 15, you had a decent chance of reaching 40 or even 50. But few people saw what we'd consider old age. Women face particularly high risks during childbirth. Without modern medicine, complications that would be routine to treat today were death sentences then. And yet humanity persisted because women kept having children, kept taking those risks, kept betting on the future. Injuries were common and often fatal. Break your leg on the savannah and you couldn't keep up with your band, couldn't hunt, couldn't gather, couldn't contribute. In the harshest times you might be left behind, not out of cruelty but because the survival of the group had to take priority over the survival of any individual. That was the calculation. Cold, brutal, necessary. But there's also evidence of compassion. Neanderthal skeletons show individuals who survived for years after suffering devastating injuries, which means their communities cared for them, shared food with them, protected them even when they couldn't contribute. Homo sapiens probably did the same. Humans are social animals. We take care of our own when we can. Predators were a constant threat. This is hard for modern people to grasp. When's the last time you worried about being eaten? But 74,000 years ago, humans were very much part of the food chain. We weren't at the top yet. Lions, leopards, hyenas, they all viewed humans as potential prey, especially children or individuals caught alone. Cave bears in some regions, crocodiles near water sources, even large raptors could carry off small children. You didn't wander off by yourself. You didn't travel at night. You always knew where the nearest tree or defensive position was. This threat shaped human behaviour in fundamental ways. We became intensely social because isolation meant death. We became cautious, suspicious of unfamiliar sounds or movements. We developed complex communication because warning your group about danger was literally a matter of life and death. These weren't personality traits, they were survival mechanisms. And then there was the competition with other human groups, not other species, but other bands of Homo sapiens. Territory disputes over valuable resources, water sources in dry regions, good hunting grounds, shelter sites. Sometimes these disputes were resolved peacefully through negotiation or intermarriage. Sometimes they weren't. Skeletal evidence from this period shows signs of interpersonal violence. Healed fractures consistent with weapon strikes, individuals who died from traumatic injuries. We were capable of cooperation within our groups, but we were also capable of violence toward outsiders. That's the human paradox, and it was already fully developed 74,000 years ago. But despite all these challenges, despite the hardship and danger and constant struggle, humanity was actually doing okay. Not great, but okay. The population was probably slowly growing. More humans every generation. Groups were spreading into new territories, testing new environments, developing new survival strategies. Some bands had begun making the journey out of Africa, following game herds or coastal resources into the Sinai Peninsula and beyond. The early stages of the Great Migration that would eventually populate the entire planet. Technology was advancing slowly but steadily. Tool designs were becoming more sophisticated. People were developing new techniques for hunting, for processing food, for creating shelters. Some groups were beginning to create art, scratching geometric patterns into rocks or shaping clay into simple figurines. The cognitive revolution that would eventually lead to symbolic thinking and complex language was well underway. Life was hard, but it was stable. Humanity had found its niche. We were surviving, even thriving in our own small way. And then the mountain exploded. But here's what makes the story so poignant. These people, our ancestors, had no way of knowing what was coming. No concept that the world could change so completely, so catastrophically, so fast. They went to sleep one night in a world that made sense, where survival was difficult but possible, where the future looked more or less like the past, where if you learned the skills your parents taught you, if you worked hard and got a little lucky, you could raise your own children and pass that knowledge down to the next generation. They had no idea that nature was about to reset the game board entirely. That within weeks, most of them would be dead. That their species would be reduced to a few thousand individuals clinging to survival in the last habitable corners of a frozen planet. They had no idea they were living in the last days of the world as they knew it. In Sumatra, 3,000 miles from the nearest human settlements in Africa, magma had been building beneath a mountain for thousands of years. Pressure accumulating, the Earth's crust bulging, warning signs that no one was equipped to recognise or understand. The humans of 74,000 years ago were good at what they did. They could read weather patterns, predict animal behaviour, find water in the driest landscapes. They'd accumulated 200,000 years of survival knowledge as a species. But they had no frame of reference for what was about to happen. Nothing in human experience, nothing in human memory prepared them for a supervolcano. And that makes what happens next even more remarkable. Because when the world ended, when everything they knew was destroyed, when 99% of their species died in the volcanic winter that followed, the survivors didn't give up. They held on. They adapted. They refused to let humanity disappear into extinction. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand exactly what happened when Toba woke up, and why it nearly succeeded in wiping us out completely. For thousands of years it had been waiting, hidden beneath tropical paradise, sleeping under layers of dense jungle and volcanic soil so fertile that plants grew with almost violent abundance. The humans living nearby had no idea what lay beneath their feet, no concept that they were building their lives on top of the most dangerous geological feature on Earth. This was Toba, a supervolcano in what we now call Sumatra, Indonesia. And 74,000 years ago it woke up. Now we need to pause here and understand what we mean by supervolcano, because the word gets thrown around a lot, but most people don't really grasp the scale we're talking about. A regular volcano is terrifying enough. Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in ash. Krakatoa's 1883 eruption was heard 3,000 miles away. Mount St. Helens blew the top off a mountain and darkened skies across North America. Those were all significant eruptions. Disasters that killed thousands, changed weather patterns, made headlines around the world. But compared to a supervolcano, they're barely a whisper. They're firecrackers next to a nuclear bomb. A supervolcano doesn't just erupt. It doesn't just explode. It detonates with a force that can alter the planet's climate for years, maybe decades. It releases so much material that it creates a crater dozens of kilometres across. It throws so much debris into the atmosphere that it blocks out the sun. And Toba wasn't just any supervolcano. It was one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years. When it finally erupted, it registered as a VEI 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. That's the maximum rating. The scale only goes to 8. There is no 9 or 10. VEI 8 represents eruptions so massive, so catastrophically powerful, that they occur maybe once every 50,000 to 100,000 years. To put this in perspective, Mount St. Helens, which we still talk about as one of the most destructive volcanic events in modern history, was a VEI 5. Toba was 5,000 times more powerful. Not 5 times, not 50 times, 5,000 times more powerful. The numbers almost become meaningless at this scale. Toba ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometres of material. That's 2,800 billion cubic metres. Imagine Mount Everest. Now imagine 700 Mount Everests worth of rock, ash and volcanic debris being blasted into the atmosphere in a matter of hours. That's what we're talking about. But the raw numbers don't capture what it was actually like. They don't convey the terror, the chaos, the apocalyptic scale of what happened when Toba awoke. For that, we need to go back to the days and weeks before the eruption, to the early humans living in Southeast Asia who were about to experience the worst day in human history. They probably noticed the warning signs. Indigenous peoples living near active volcanic regions often develop an intuitive understanding of geological activity. They would have felt the earthquakes, not just a few tremors, but hundreds of them over weeks or months. Small quakes at first, barely noticeable, then larger ones. Shaking that knocked over objects, cracked walls if they had any structures, sent animals fleeing in panic. The ground itself would have started behaving strangely. Areas that had been solid for generations suddenly becoming soft, unreliable. Springs that had flowed clear for years turning hot and sulphurous. New vents opening in the earth, hissing steam and toxic gases. Trees dying in circular patches. Lakes warming to temperatures that killed all the fish. Animals would have known something was wrong long before humans fully understood. Birds abandoning their nests. Elephants and other. Large mammals migrating away from regions they'd occupied for generations. Insects disappearing. Everything that could move was moving away from the volcano. Some humans probably moved too. The smart ones, the cautious ones. Those who respected the warnings written in the earth and sky. They would have gathered their families and relocated to safer ground, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever was causing the mountains to shake and the earth to groan. But most stayed, because humans are optimistic. We adapt. We normalise. Maybe the tremors would stop. Maybe the ground would settle. Maybe whatever was happening would pass and life would return to normal. This had been home for generations. Their ancestors were buried here. Moving meant abandoning everything, heading into unknown territory, competing for resources with other groups who wouldn't welcome strangers. So they stayed. And then, one morning around 74,000 years ago, the world ended. It probably started with an earthquake larger than any that had come before. Not the familiar shaking they'd grown accustomed to over previous weeks, but a violent convulsion that threw people to the ground and wouldn't stop. The kind of shaking that makes standing impossible, that opens massive fissures in the earth, that brings down anything humans might have built. Then, the sound. Imagine the loudest thunder you've ever heard. Now multiply it by 1,000. October's eruption created a sound that propagated across thousands of kilometres. People as far away as India would have heard it. A low, rumbling roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the earth itself, growing louder and louder until it became physically painful, until it was less a sound and more a pressure wave you could feel in your bones. Then came the explosion. The actual eruption sequence probably lasted several days, but the initial blast happened in moments. The pressure that had been building beneath Toba for thousands of years finally exceeded the strength of the rock containing it. Millions of tons of overlying earth simply exploded upward and outward at supersonic speeds. The eruption column shot straight up into the atmosphere, not slowly, not gradually, but in an instant blast that punched through the cloud layer and kept going, up and up and up, 40 kilometres high, 50 kilometres, breaching the stratosphere, carrying with it superheated rock, volcanic ash, toxic gases, and everything else that had been trapped beneath the surface. At the base of this column, where the volcano had been, there was now only destruction. The summit didn't just collapse, it vaporized. The magma chamber beneath, once full of molten rock under unimaginable pressure, emptied in hours. And when a magma chamber empties, the ground above has nowhere to go but down. This is how calderas form. The volcano doesn't just explode outward, it also collapses inward, creating a massive depression, a crater of almost incomprehensible size. Toba's caldera measured 100 kilometres long and 30 kilometres wide, a hole in the earth large enough to swallow entire mountain ranges. Today it's filled with water, forming Lake Toba, one of the largest volcanic lakes on the planet. But 74,000 years ago it was a smoking, steaming crater filled with superheated gases and continued volcanic activity. But the caldera formation, as dramatic as it sounds, was almost a secondary concern for anyone nearby, because the immediate threat wasn't the hole left behind, it was what was coming out of that hole, pyroclastic flows. If you're not familiar with the term, Pyroclastic flows are one of the most terrifying phenomena in nature. They're avalanches of superheated gas, ash and rock that race down the sides of volcanoes at speeds exceeding 700 kilometers per hour. They're not flowing lava. Lava moves slowly enough that you can usually escape. Pyroclastic flows move faster than anything can run. They're death incarnate, walls of 700-degree gas that incinerate everything in their path. Toba's pyroclastic flows were unprecedented in scale. They raced outward from the eruption site in all directions, across valleys, up and over hills, following river channels, consuming forests that had stood for thousands of years. Any humans within 100 kilometers of the volcano would have had no chance of survival. The flows moved too fast. The heat was too intense. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Those who were further away might have had a few minutes' warning, time to see the massive grey wall approaching, time to realise what was happening, time to know they were about to die, but not time to escape. Beyond the immediate kill zone of the pyroclastic flows, the eruption created other immediate catastrophes. The shockwave from the initial explosion radiated outward at the speed of sound, flattening forests, destroying any structures, creating avalanches in distant mountains. The sound alone was probably enough to rupture eardrums hundreds of kilometers away. Then came the ashfall. The eruption column carrying cubic kilometers of pulverized rock couldn't stay aloft forever. What goes up must come down, and it came down everywhere. Across Southeast Asia, across India, across the Indian Ocean, across parts of the Middle East and East Africa. The closest areas received meters of ash, entire landscapes buried under grey powder, every plant killed, every water source contaminated, every animal that couldn't flee fast enough entombed where it stood. Archaeological evidence from India shows ash deposits from Toba that are 6 meters deep in some locations. 6 meters. That's taller than a 2-story building. Imagine your entire world buried under 20 feet of toxic volcanic debris. But even in areas that received less ash, the fallout was catastrophic. A few centimetres might not sound like much, but volcanic ash isn't like snow. It doesn't melt. It's composed of tiny glass particles and toxic minerals. It contaminates water supplies, making them undrinkable. It coats vegetation, making it inedible. It gets into lungs, causing respiratory failure. Animals that try to graze in ash-covered areas die from intestinal blockages. Predators that eat those animals die from starvation. And the ash kept falling. For days. Maybe weeks. Depending on how far you were from the eruption, you might wake up every morning to find another few centimetres of grey powder covering everything, burying the previous day's attempts to clear pathways, coating your skin, getting into your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your lungs, every breath an act of suffering. Humans who survived the initial explosion and pyroclastic flows now faced an impossible situation. The sky had gone dark, not the darkness of night, which passes, but a darkness that didn't end. The eruption column had pumped so much debris into the upper atmosphere that sunlight couldn't penetrate. Midday looked like twilight. The temperature began to drop almost immediately. This wasn't the slow temperature decline we'd think of as winter. This was sudden, dramatic cooling. The superheated gases from the eruption had actually warmed the atmosphere initially, creating bizarre weather patterns, massive thunderstorms, torrential rains that turned ash into mud flows. But once the gases dispersed and the ash remained, blocking sunlight, temperatures plummeted. Within weeks, regions that had been tropical paradise were experiencing near-freezing temperatures. Plants that had never known cold began dying. Animals that had evolved for warm climates started starving as their food sources disappeared. The entire food web was collapsing in real time, and this was just the beginning. The immediate effects of the eruption, as catastrophic as they were merely the opening act. The real disaster was still unfolding, because Toba had just injected something far more dangerous than ash into the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide, billions of tons of it, Released from the magma during the eruption, this gas would rise into the stratosphere and react with water vapour to form sulfuric acid droplets. These droplets would create a reflective layer in the upper atmosphere, a mirror that would bounce sunlight back into space before it could warm the Earth's surface. The humans struggling to survive in the immediate aftermath of the eruption couldn't have known this. They couldn't have understood the atmospheric chemistry that was sealing their fate. All they knew was that the darkness wasn't lifting, that the cold was getting worse, that the ash was still falling, that their children were crying from hunger, that the game animals had disappeared, that the plants were dying, that the water sources were toxic. They didn't know that this was going to continue for years. They didn't know they were at the beginning of a volcanic winter that would test human survival like never before. They couldn't have imagined that the eruption they'd just survived was only the first challenge in a crisis that would last for generations. Southeast Asia was now uninhabitable. The regions closest to Toba were buried under meters of ash and would remain barren for decades. The survivors, those who had been far enough away to escape the immediate kill zone but close enough to be affected by the ashfall and climate effects, faced a choice: stay and die, or flee to uncertain sanctuary. Most chose to flee. They had no choice, moving north into India where the ash was less deep, moving west toward the Middle East, moving east toward China, any direction that led away from the grey wasteland that had once been their home. Small bands of survivors carrying what little they could, leaving behind everything they'd known. But they would soon discover that the eruption's effects weren't localised. The darkness was spreading. The cold was global. The ash was falling across multiple continents. No matter which direction they fled, they were running toward the same catastrophe they were fleeing. Because Toba hadn't just destroyed Southeast Asia, it had triggered a planetary climate crisis that would affect every human population on Earth. The monster had awakened, and now the entire human species would pay the price. The survivors of the eruption itself, those who had escaped the immediate devastation, were about to face something even worse. Because the eruption was over, but the volcanic winter was just beginning. And for the next 6 years the sun would barely shine. The plants would die. The animals would starve, and humanity would be pushed to the absolute edge of extinction. The greatest test in human history was underway, and most of us wouldn't make it. The ash cloud reached the stratosphere in less than an hour, 28 kilometres high, punching through every layer of atmosphere, spreading outward at speeds that would have terrified anyone watching. But nobody was watching from a distance. The humans near Toba were already dead or dying. The ones far enough away to survive the initial blast had no idea what was coming. Within 48 hours, the ash cloud had circled the equator. Within a week, it had reached both poles. And within 2 weeks, the entire planet was wrapped in a shroud of volcanic particles so thick that noon looked like twilight, and twilight looked like midnight. But the ash wasn't the worst part. Not even close. The real killer was invisible. Sulfur dioxide. The eruption had injected 5,000 megatons of it into the upper atmosphere. To put that in perspective, that's more sulfur than all of human industry has produced in the last century. And it was all released in a matter of hours. At those altitudes, sulfur dioxide doesn't just sit there. It reacts with water vapour, forming microscopic droplets of sulfuric acid. Millions of tons of it, suspended in the stratosphere, creating a reflective barrier that would persist for years. Sunlight hitting this barrier didn't make it to the ground. It bounced back into space. The planet's energy budget, the delicate balance between incoming solar radiation and outgoing heat, collapsed. Earth's thermostat had been smashed, and there was no way to fix it. The temperature drop started within days. At first it was subtle, a degree here, 2 degrees there. People probably didn't even notice initially, but it didn't stop. Week after week, month after month, the temperatures kept falling. Global average temperatures plummeted by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but remember, the difference between our current climate and the last ice age is only about 5 degrees. We're talking about an ice age level cooling event, except it happened in months instead of millennia. And those were just the global averages. Some regions got hit far worse. Northern latitudes, already experiencing the tail end of their seasonal cold periods, saw temperatures drop 10, 12, even 15 degrees Celsius. Places that had experienced mild winters suddenly faced Arctic conditions. Places that had been Arctic became utterly uninhabitable. But it was what happened in the tropics that really sealed humanity's fate. These were the regions where most early humans lived. Warm, stable, resource-rich environments that had supported human populations for millions of years. Suddenly they were experiencing killing frosts. In Central Africa, in Southeast Asia, in regions that had never seen temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius, it was now dropping below freezing at night. The plants died first, not all at once, but in waves. The fast-growing annuals went within weeks. Without adequate sunlight for photosynthesis, they simply couldn't sustain themselves. They yellowed, withered, and collapsed. Then the shrubs and small trees. Then, over the course of months, even the massive hardwoods that had stood for centuries began to fail. Their leaves dropped early, their growth stopped, their root systems began to die back. Imagine walking through a tropical forest as it dies around you. The vibrant greens fade into yellow, then brown, the canopy thinning, letting through that strange dim light that filters down through the ash clouds. The sounds changing as animal populations crash. Fewer bird calls, fewer insects. An eerie, spreading silence broken only by the occasional crack of a dying branch or the crash of a falling tree. The forest didn't burn. That might have been better, actually. Fire creates clearings where new growth can start. Fire releases nutrients back into the soil, but these forests just rotted. Cold, dark, and wet. The dead vegetation accumulated in massive piles. Fungi exploded in the gloom, breaking down the dead plant matter, but nothing was growing to replace what was lost. And without the plants, the entire food chain collapsed. The herbivores went first. The massive megafauna that had dominated African and Asian landscapes, the giant elephant-like animals, the enormous, browsing mammals. They needed hundreds of pounds of vegetation every day. When the plants died, starvation followed within weeks. You'd have seen them wandering through the dying forests, getting thinner and weaker, until they couldn't stand anymore, their bodies littering the landscape, too numerous for scavengers to fully consume. The smaller herbivores lasted a bit longer. Rodents, small antelopes, animals that could survive on seeds and roots. But even these resources were finite. The plants had stopped producing new seeds. The root systems were dying. And with each passing month there was simply less food available. Populations that had numbered in the millions crashed to thousands, then to hundreds, then to nothing. The predators followed their prey into oblivion. Lions, hyenas, wild dogs, the entire guild of African carnivores found themselves in a world with nothing to hunt. Some tried switching to scavenging full-time, competing with vultures for the rotting remains of herbivores. But those carcasses ran out. Some predators tried hunting each other, turning to desperate cannibalism. But that was just delaying the inevitable. When the herbivores went extinct locally, the carnivores couldn't be far behind. And the humans? The humans were caught in the middle of this nightmare. Not herbivores, so they couldn't survive on plants alone. Not pure carnivores, so they couldn't just hunt. They were omnivores, dependent on a diverse diet of plant food supplemented with meat. And suddenly, both resources were disappearing at the same time. The archaeological record from this period is haunting. What few sites we have from the immediate aftermath of Toba show signs of extreme stress. Toolmaking becomes more desperate, less refined. People were using whatever they could find, not carefully selecting the best materials. Butchery marks on bones show extensive processing. Animals stripped of every possible calorie. Bones split open for marrow. Even the skulls cracked open to extract the brains. Signs of nutritional stress show up on the bones themselves, arrested growth lines indicating periods of severe malnutrition. But the physical evidence only tells part of the story. To really understand what humans went through during the volcanic winter, you have to imagine it. You're living in a world that has become fundamentally hostile to life. The sun, that reliable source of light and warmth that has governed every rhythm of existence since life began, is gone. Not literally gone, but blocked, reduced to a dim glow that barely penetrates the perpetual haze. You can't tell time anymore. Days blend into nights blend into days. The only way you know it's daytime is that the darkness becomes slightly less absolute. The cold is relentless. Even in the tropics, even in regions that had never experienced winter, temperatures now drop below freezing every night. You don't have adequate clothing. Your ancestors never needed it. You don't have reliable fire. Wood is wet from the constant ash-laden rain that falls from the poison sky. When you do manage to start a fire, you have to keep it going because starting a new one is nearly impossible. Fire becomes more precious than food, at least temporarily. The hunger is worse than the cold. At first, there's still food, scavenging the dying animals, gathering the last fruits from trees that are already starting to fail. But within months, those resources are exhausted. Now you're eating things your people never considered food before. Insects, if you can find them. Tree bark. Roots that might be toxic, but eating them is better than not eating at all. You watch the children starving. You watch the elderly give up, stop eating so the younger members of the group might have a chance. You make impossible calculations about who needs food most, who's most likely to survive. And through it all, the ash keeps falling. Thick, choking clouds of it. It gets in your eyes, your nose, your lungs. It coats everything in a grey powder that never seems to wash away. When it rains, and it rains constantly now, the water is acidic, contaminated with sulfur compounds that burn your skin and make the water barely drinkable. The ash mixed with rain creates a thick sludge that buries the landscape. Rivers become choked with it. Water sources turn toxic. Respiratory diseases explode. The fine ash particles damage lung tissue, making every breath painful. Infections follow. With everyone weakened by malnutrition and constantly exposed to the elements, immune systems collapse. Diseases that a healthy person could fight off become death sentences. Entire groups probably died not from starvation, but from pneumonia or tuberculosis, or infections that spread through malnourished populations like wildfire. The psychological impact might have been the worst part. Humans are adapted to see patterns, to understand cause and effect, to predict the future based on past experience. But nothing in human experience had prepared them for this. The world had ended, and there was no explanation, no way to understand what had happened or when it might get better. For all they knew, this was permanent. The sun had been taken away. The world would always be dark and cold and dying. Some groups probably gave up, just stopped trying. When you're cold, starving, watching your children die, and you have no reason to believe tomorrow will be any different from today, why keep struggling? The evolutionary psychology that normally pushes humans to survive at all costs can break under sufficient stress. Depression, despair, the simple decision to stop fighting and let the darkness take you. But some didn't give up. Somehow, some groups found the will to keep going. And more than that, they found ways to adapt to conditions that should have been unsurvivable. This is where the story becomes less about climate and more about human ingenuity. Because the volcanic winter didn't last forever, but it lasted long enough that simple endurance wasn't sufficient. The people who survived didn't just wait it out. They invented new survival strategies. Some groups migrated, following the retreating warm zones, moving toward the equator or to coastal areas where the ocean's thermal mass helped moderate temperature extremes. These migrations were desperate affairs, walking for weeks or months through landscapes empty of food, hoping to find something better on the other side. Many migration attempts must have failed, groups walking into territories already occupied by other desperate humans, groups running out of food before reaching their destinations, groups getting lost in the perpetual twilight and never finding their way. But some migration succeeded. We know this because genetic evidence shows population movements during this period, small groups that managed to reach refugia, isolated pockets where conditions were slightly less catastrophic. River valleys that still had water, coastal areas where shellfish could still be harvested, cave systems that provided shelter from the cold and the ash. Other groups stayed in place but radically changed how they survived. They became dietary specialists in ways their ancestors never had been. Some groups moved to coastal areas and became heavily dependent on marine resources. Fish, shellfish, seals, anything they could extract from the ocean. Marine ecosystems were buffered against the volcanic winter in ways that terrestrial ecosystems weren't. The ocean's enormous thermal mass meant water temperatures dropped more slowly. Photosynthesis might have been reduced, but it didn't stop entirely in the upper layers of the ocean. Marine food chains were stressed, but not completely broken. Other groups became extreme scavengers, following the die-offs of large animals and living off the carrion. This was a dangerous strategy. Spoiled meat could kill you. Competition with other scavengers, both human and animal, could get violent. But for groups that could master the art of finding and processing carcasses quickly, it provided a temporary food source while they developed other strategies. Still, other groups may have developed the first systematic use of storage and preservation. This is where being able to plan ahead and think abstractly became a life or death advantage. If you could figure out how to preserve meat through smoking or drying, you could harvest more during the relatively good periods and make it last through the bad times. If you could identify and store plant foods that didn't spoil, roots and tubers and nuts, you could create a buffer against starvation. This required thinking months ahead, something that's cognitively demanding but that humans were uniquely capable of. And through all of this, the social dynamics of survival became critical. Groups that cooperated, that shared resources and knowledge, had better survival chances than groups that didn't. But cooperation was also incredibly stressed during this period. When food is scarce, the temptation to hoard resources for your own family becomes overwhelming. Conflicts over resources must have been constant. Some groups probably tore themselves apart from internal fighting. Others developed the social mechanisms to maintain cooperation even under extreme stress. The evidence suggests that group size became critical, too large, and you couldn't feed everyone. Resources that might sustain 20 people wouldn't sustain 50. Large groups probably fractured during this period, splitting into smaller units that had better chances of finding enough food. But too small was dangerous too. A group of 5 people had no buffer against bad luck. If one person died, that was 20% of your labour force gone. If 2 people died, the group might not be viable anymore. There was probably an optimal size, maybe 15 to 25 people, large enough to handle setbacks but small enough to feed consistently. And the volcanic winter didn't end cleanly. It wasn't 6 years of horror and then suddenly everything returned to normal. The sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere took approximately 6 to 10 years to wash out. During that time, temperatures slowly began to recover. The perpetual gloom gradually lifted. Sunlight started breaking through the ash clouds, weak at first, then stronger. But the damage had been done. Ecosystems that had collapsed couldn't rebuild overnight. It takes years for forests to regrow, decades for large animal populations to recover, generations for complex food webs to re-establish themselves. And the climate didn't just return to pre-eruption conditions. The massive injection of volcanic gases had altered atmospheric chemistry in ways that persisted for centuries. What followed the volcanic winter was a 1,000-year cooling period, not as severe as the immediate aftermath of the eruption, but significantly colder than what had come before. Ice cores from this period show temperature variability that would have made life incredibly difficult. Decades of relative warmth followed by decades of cold. Unpredictable rainfall patterns. Growing seasons that shifted and changed from generation to generation. The human populations that had survived the volcanic winter now faced a new challenge. They had adapted to extreme crisis conditions, developing survival strategies for the worst possible circumstances. But now they needed to adapt again, this time to chronic instability. Not a single catastrophic event, but ongoing uncertainty. Never knowing if next year would be warm or cold, wet or dry, abundant or scarce. This prolonged period of instability is actually what completed the genetic bottleneck. The volcanic winter killed the vast majority of humans, but the 1,000-year cooling period that followed kept human population suppressed. Every few generations another climate shock would hit. Temperatures would drop, rainfall would fail, food sources would collapse, and each time human populations would crash again. Only the groups that had developed the most flexible survival strategies made it through. The ones that could switch between food sources rapidly. The ones that could migrate quickly when conditions changed. The ones that could innovate new technologies when old methods stopped working. The ones that could maintain social cooperation even under stress. Over those 1,000 years, natural selection carved away everything that wasn't absolutely essential for survival in unstable conditions. Physical robustness, specialized adaptations for specific environments, rigid behavioral patterns, all of these were selected against. What remained was a small population of incredibly adaptable, incredibly resourceful humans who could survive almost anything. But here's the really remarkable thing. They didn't just survive, they remembered. The archaeological record shows that tool-making traditions persisted through the bottleneck. Knowledge about fire, shelter, hunting strategies, all of this was preserved and passed down even when populations crashed to nearly nothing. Cultural information survived when whole populations didn't. This tells us something profound about what made these survivors different. They didn't just adapt individually, they adapted collectively. Groups that could preserve and transmit knowledge across generations had survival advantages that groups without these capabilities didn't. The volcanic winter selected for social learning abilities, for teaching, for language, for the capacity to share information about survival strategies that worked and ones that didn't. By the time the 1,000-year cooling period finally ended, around 69,000 years ago, the human population had been through a filter unlike anything experienced by any other species. They were the descendants of the most adaptable, most innovative, most cooperative individuals from a population that had already been reduced to the absolute minimum. They carried in their genes and in their cultural knowledge the lessons of the longest, most brutal survival test in human history, and they were about to explode across the planet. But before we get to that expansion, we need to understand exactly what the bottleneck did to human genetics. Because the volcanic winter didn't just kill most humans, it fundamentally rewrote our DNA, and the evidence for this rewriting is still visible in every human alive today. In 1995, a geneticist at Stanford University made a discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about human history. His name was Luigi Luca Cavalli-Sforza, and he was doing something that sounds pretty straightforward. Comparing human DNA samples from populations around the world. He expected to find what you'd find in any successful species spread across multiple continents. Lots of genetic diversity. Different populations with different traits shaped by thousands of generations of local adaptation. African. Populations genetically distinct from Asian populations. Europeans different from both. Indigenous Americans carrying unique genetic signatures from tens of thousands of years of isolation. That's not what he found. Instead, he discovered something that made absolutely no sense. Humans, despite living on 6 continents, despite encompassing billions of individuals, despite occupying nearly every ecosystem on the planet, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests, had remarkably little genetic diversity. In fact, we had suspiciously little genetic diversity, the kind of low diversity you'd expect from a species that had recently been pushed to the brink of extinction. Other researchers began looking deeper, and the pattern held up. No matter which genetic markers they examined, no matter which populations they sampled, the result was the same. All humans everywhere were incredibly closely related, more closely related than they had any right to be. Then came the really shocking part. When geneticists compared human genetic diversity to our closest relatives, the numbers became absolutely bizarre. A single community of chimpanzees living in one forest in Tanzania had more genetic diversity than all 8 billion humans on Earth combined. A troop of a few hundred gorillas in the Congo showed greater genetic variation than every human population from Alaska to Australia. This wasn't just unusual. This was a red flag the size of a continent. Species don't naturally have this little genetic diversity. Not successful species that have been steadily growing for millions of years. The only time you see genetic patterns like this is when a species has gone through what population geneticists call a bottleneck, a catastrophic population crash that kills off most of the genetic diversity, leaving only a tiny remnant to rebuild the entire species. Something had nearly wiped out humanity, and it had happened recently, at least in evolutionary terms. The race was on to figure out when this bottleneck occurred and how severe it had been. Researchers began examining specific types of DNA that are particularly useful for tracing human history. The first breakthrough came from studying mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through the mother's line. Your mitochondrial DNA is identical to your mother's, which was identical to her mother's, going back generation after generation. Mutations accumulate slowly in mitochondrial DNA, acting like a molecular clock that lets scientists trace lineages backward through time. When researchers mapped out the mitochondrial DNA lineages of people from around the world, they all traced back to a common ancestor. One woman who lived in Africa sometime between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The media dubbed her Mitochondrial Eve, and suddenly everyone was talking about the mother of all humanity. But here's where it gets really interesting. The data showed something else, something that didn't fit the steady evolutionary story we'd been taught. Around 70,000 years ago, the mitochondrial DNA lineages showed a dramatic narrowing. Most of the genetic diversity that should have accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years just disappeared. It was like watching a mighty river suddenly forced through a narrow canyon, with most of the water simply vanishing. Then researchers looked at Y chromosome DNA, which traces paternal lineages the same way mitochondrial DNA traces maternal ones. They found the exact same pattern. All human Y chromosomes traced back to a common ancestor, Y chromosomal Adam, who lived somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. And right around 70,000 years ago, boom! Another dramatic bottleneck. The genetic diversity narrowed to almost nothing before slowly expanding again. The pieces were falling into place. Both maternal and paternal lineages showed the same catastrophic population collapse at the same time, 70,000 years ago, the same time Toba erupted. But how severe was this bottleneck? How close did humanity come to extinction? This is where the numbers get truly terrifying. By comparing the amount of genetic diversity in modern humans to the rate at which new mutations accumulate, geneticists could estimate how many breeding individuals survived the bottleneck. The calculations varied depending on which genetic markers were used and which mathematical models were applied, but they all pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. The global human population crashed to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. Some estimates went even lower, suggesting perhaps as few as 1,000 breeding pairs. That's not 1,000 people per continent or 1,000 people per country. That's 1,000 breeding pairs for the entire species, for the entire planet. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, descended from that tiny remnant population. Think about what that means. Your ancestors, regardless of where your family comes from, were part of a group that would have fit inside a modern sports stadium, with room to spare. That's how close we came to joining the 99% of species that have ever existed and then gone extinct. But the genetic evidence revealed something even more remarkable. It wasn't just that the population crashed, it stayed crashed for thousands of years. This wasn't a brief disaster followed by rapid recovery. The genetic signatures suggested the human population remained dangerously low for somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 years after the initial bottleneck. That's not a single catastrophic event. That's a prolonged survival crisis that lasted longer than all of recorded human history. Generation after generation, our ancestors lived on the knife's edge of extinction. Any additional disaster, disease outbreak, drought, or conflict between groups could have finished the job. The fact that we're here at all means those survivors got incredibly lucky, or incredibly resourceful, or most likely both, again and again for thousands of generations. The genetic evidence shows up in other ways too. Specific mutations that are found in all human populations worldwide must have been present in that bottleneck population. Everyone carries them, because everyone descended from ancestors who survived the catastrophe. One of the most fascinating examples involves the gene for the FOXP2 protein, which plays a crucial role in language ability. All humans share virtually identical versions of this gene, with mutations that appear to have been under strong selection pressure around the time of the bottleneck. This suggests that during the survival crisis, the ability to communicate effectively became critical. Groups that could coordinate their survival strategies, share information about resources and dangers, and pass complex knowledge to the next generation had massive advantages over groups that couldn't. Over thousands of years of desperate survival, natural selection refined human communication abilities in ways that would have taken millions of years under normal circumstances. The bottleneck also explained some weird quirks of human genetics that had puzzled researchers for decades. We have remarkably few rare genetic variants compared to other species. Most animal populations accumulate lots of unusual mutations that exist in only a few individuals. These rare variants are the raw material of evolution, providing genetic diversity that can help a species adapt to new challenges. Humans have very few of them. Why? Because during the bottleneck, most rare variants disappeared. If you're one of 10,000 humans and you carry a rare mutation that only exists in you and a few close relatives, and your family group doesn't survive the volcanic winter, that mutation vanishes forever. Multiply this across thousands of genes and hundreds of generations, and you get a species with remarkably uniform genetics. But here's where the story gets complicated. Not all geneticists are convinced that Toba caused the bottleneck. The timing matches up almost perfectly 70,000 years ago. The severity of the population crash matches what you'd expect from a supervolcanic winter. The geographic evidence shows the eruption was absolutely devastating. But correlation isn't causation, and some researchers think the genetic evidence might be telling a different story. The main problem is uncertainty in the genetic clock. When we say the bottleneck happened 70,000 years ago, there's actually a margin of error of plus or minus 20,000 years or more. Different studies using different genetic markers sometimes produce ages ranging from 50,000 to 100,000 years ago for the same population collapse. Some of these dates don't line up perfectly with the Toba eruption. Then there's the question of whether one event, even a supervolcanic eruption, could really reduce the entire global human population to a few thousand individuals. Critics point out that humans lived in Africa, Europe and Asia at the time. For one catastrophe to nearly exterminate populations on 3 continents simultaneously would require environmental impacts of unprecedented severity. Some researchers have proposed alternative explanations. Maybe the bottleneck wasn't caused by a single catastrophic event, but by a longer period of harsh climate conditions. The period between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago was marked by intense cold phases during the Ice Age. Perhaps the global human population was slowly squeezed by expanding glaciers, shrinking habitable zones, and declining food resources over thousands of years. Others suggest disease might have played a role. A pandemic sweeping through small, scattered human populations could have decimated group after group, leaving only isolated survivors. The genetic signatures would look similar to those caused by an environmental catastrophe, but the mechanism would be completely different. There's also the multi-catastrophe theory. Maybe humanity faced not one but several near-extinction events in rapid succession. Toba erupts, causing immediate devastation. Then, while populations are still recovering, a second climate disaster hits. Then disease outbreaks. Then conflicts over shrinking resources. Each event kills off more genetic diversity until only the toughest, luckiest, or most adaptable groups remain. The debate continues among researchers, but here's what everyone agrees on. Something catastrophic happened to humanity around 70,000 years ago. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. Our species went through a severe population bottleneck that reduced genetic diversity to levels seen only in endangered species. Whether Toba was the primary cause, a contributing factor, or just coincidental timing, the result was the same. Humanity came dangerously close to extinction. But the genetic evidence tells us something else, something even more profound than the near disaster itself. It reveals the incredible unity of the human species. Every person alive today is related to every other person alive today through ancestors who lived just 2,000 to 3,000 generations ago. That's nothing in evolutionary terms, it's a blink of an eye. When geneticists construct family trees using DNA from populations around the world, they find that any two humans, picked at random from anywhere on the planet, are at most 50th cousins. Most are much more closely related than that. If you're of European descent, you share ancestors with every other European within the last 1,000 years. If you go back 300 to 400 years, everyone alive today of any ancestry shares at least one common ancestor. This is mind-blowing when you think about it. The genetic differences that we focus on, skin colour, facial features, hair texture, these are incredibly superficial variations that developed only in the last few tens of thousands of years as human populations adapted to different climates. Underneath those surface differences, we're all carrying the genetic legacy of those bottleneck survivors. We're all members of the same family tree, all descendants of the same small group that refused to let humanity die. The genetic evidence even shows us where those survivors lived. The highest genetic diversity in modern humans is found in African populations, particularly in southern and eastern Africa. This suggests that the primary bottleneck refuges, the places where human population survived in the greatest numbers, were located there. Some groups might have survived elsewhere in small isolated pockets, but the main reservoir of human genetic diversity made it through in Africa. This makes sense when you think about the Toba eruption's likely impacts. Africa, particularly equatorial and southern regions, would have been the furthest from the eruption site. While ashfall and cooling would have affected the entire planet, African populations would have experienced less immediate devastation than groups closer to the eruption in Southeast Asia. They would have had more time to adapt, more opportunities to find refuge, and better chances of maintaining viable population sizes. But they still suffered catastrophically. Even the populations that were furthest from the disaster, most sheltered from the immediate effects, and best positioned to survive, still lost most of their genetic diversity. This tells us the Toba winter wasn't just bad. It was globally catastrophic on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. The genetic bottleneck also explains why humans show such little physical variation compared to other widespread species. Bears living on different continents look radically different from each other. Asian elephants and African elephants are separate species, but humans from Africa, Asia, Europe and the Americas, despite tens of thousands of years of geographic separation, can all interbreed and produce fertile offspring. We're all still essentially the same species, because we all descend from the same recent common ancestor population. More recent genetic studies using advanced sequencing techniques have revealed even more details about the bottleneck and its aftermath. Researchers can now identify specific genes that show evidence of selection during and after the population crash. These are genes where certain variants became nearly universal in human populations, suggesting they provided crucial survival advantages during the crisis. Some of these genes are involved in immune function, suggesting disease resistance became critically important during the bottleneck period. Others affect metabolism, particularly the ability to process different food sources efficiently. When your usual food supply disappears under volcanic ash and climate chaos, the ability to extract nutrition from alternative sources becomes a matter of life and death. Still others involve brain development and cognitive function. This supports the idea that intelligence, problem-solving ability, and social cooperation were key factors in determining which humans survived and which didn't. The bottleneck wasn't random. It wasn't just bad luck that killed off 90% or more of humanity. It was a brutal selection event that favoured specific traits, and those traits are still with us today. Perhaps the most important insight from the genetic evidence is this: we are all survivors, not metaphorically, literally. Every single person alive today carries genes that made it through the most severe survival test in human history. Your ancestors, whoever they were, wherever they lived, survived when the world turned dark and cold and deadly. They survived when food disappeared. They survived when civilizations that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years collapsed. They survived when their neighbours, their rivals, and probably most of their own families died. They were the toughest, smartest, luckiest, or most cooperative members of their groups. They were the ones who figured out how to find food in the darkness, the ones who kept their families alive through the endless winters, the ones who maintained hope when everything suggested humanity's time on Earth was finished. And then, when the volcanic winter finally ended and the world began to recover, they were the ones who rebuilt. They passed their survival genes, their resilience, their adaptability, and their determination down through 70,000 years and 2,000 generations to reach you. That's your genetic inheritance. That's written in every cell of your body. You are the product of the greatest survival story in human history, and the evidence is literally coded into your DNA. But the story doesn't end with survival, because what happened next, what those bottleneck survivors did as the world recovered, would determine not just whether humanity survived, but whether we would thrive, expand, and eventually dominate the entire planet. The genetic bottleneck had created something unprecedented in evolutionary history. A species with remarkably uniform genetics, a species that had been refined by the most intense natural selection event imaginable, and a species that was about to explode across the globe in a wave of expansion that would reshape the entire world. The survivors had made it through the crisis. Now they were about to show what they could do with a second chance. After 6 years of darkness, when the volcanic winter finally began to release its grip, the survivors emerged into a world transformed beyond recognition. But here's the question that haunts anthropologists. Where were they? Where did those 1,280 individuals hide while the rest of the world froze? And more importantly, how did they survive when nearly everyone else died? The answer is written in stone tools, genetic markers, and the scattered archaeological sites that mark humanity's darkest hour. Those survivors weren't randomly distributed across the globe. They were concentrated in very specific refuge zones, places where a unique combination of factors created tiny pockets of survivability in an otherwise dead world. The primary refuge was East Africa, the same region where our species had first evolved now became our last sanctuary, but not all of East Africa. The survivors were concentrated along the East African Rift Valley, a geological scar that runs from Ethiopia through Kenya and Tanzania. creating a unique environment unlike anywhere else on the planet. The Rift Valley offered something critical: elevation diversity. Within a few days' walk, you could move from high plateaus to low valleys, from dry savannas to forested highlands. When volcanic winter devastated the lowlands, you could retreat to higher elevations. When frost destroyed highland vegetation, you could descend to valleys that stayed slightly warmer. But that wasn't enough on its own. What made the Rift Valley truly special was its geological activity. This was, and still is, one of the most volcanically and seismically active regions on Earth. And volcanic activity meant something crucial: geothermal heat, hot springs, warm caves, areas where the Earth's internal heat broke through the surface, creating microclimates that remained habitable even when everything around them froze. Modern archaeological surveys have found Toba-era occupation sites clustered around these geothermal features. Our ancestors literally huddled around the Earth's warmth while the surface froze. Think about what that means. While the rest of humanity was scattered across Africa and Asia, dying as their environments collapsed, a few small groups stumbled onto the one type of location that could sustain human life. They didn't know they were looking for geothermal areas. They were just moving, searching desperately for any place that offered shelter and warmth. And some of them, through pure chance, found it. There's also evidence for a second refuge in South Africa, particularly around the coastal regions. Cave sites like Pinnacle Point show continuous human occupation through the Toba period. These survivors had a different strategy. They turned to the ocean. While terrestrial ecosystems collapsed, marine environments were less affected by the volcanic winter. Oceans have enormous thermal mass. They don't cool down quickly. While temperatures plummeted on land, coastal waters remained relatively stable, and that meant food: shellfish, fish, seals, kelp. The South African coast offered a buffer of resources that could sustain small populations even when land-based hunting and gathering became impossible. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a dramatic increase in marine resource exploitation. Shell middens, fish bones, tools specifically designed for processing seafood. These coastal survivors were doing something unprecedented in human history. They were becoming specialized marine foragers, developing the skills and technologies to exploit an entirely new food source. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. The land had failed them. The ocean was all that was left. But both groups, whether they were clustered around East African hot springs or sheltering in the South African coastal caves, faced the same brutal reality. The world outside their refuges was a death trap. They couldn't range far from their safe zones. They couldn't follow migrating herds anymore because there were no herds to follow. They couldn't gather plant foods from wide territories because the plants were dead. They were trapped, confined to tiny pockets of habitability in a frozen wasteland, and that confinement created unprecedented evolutionary pressure. Let's talk about what daily survival looked like during those years of darkness, because understanding the specific challenges these people faced helps us understand the adaptations they developed, the traits that would eventually separate us from every other human species that had ever existed. First, shelter. In volcanic winter conditions, you die without it. Exposure kills you in hours, not days. Our ancestors became cave dwellers not by choice, but by necessity. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of semi-permanent cave occupation. These weren't temporary shelters used for a night or two. These were home bases occupied continuously for years, maybe decades. But caves present their own challenges. They're cold, dark, often damp. They can become death traps if you're not careful about ventilation, especially when you're burning fires continuously. The survivors had to learn cave management, how to position fires for maximum heat and minimum smoke buildup, where to sleep to stay warm but avoid carbon monoxide poisoning, how to keep the cave entrance defensible against predators that were also seeking shelter. Second, fire. This wasn't optional. Without fire, you freeze. Without fire, You can't cook food, and during a period of food scarcity, being able to extract maximum nutrition from whatever you can find becomes a matter of life and death. The survivors became obsessive about fire maintenance. Archaeological evidence shows hearths that burned continuously for years. We're not talking about lighting a new fire every evening. We're talking about maintaining fires that never went out, protecting coals with religious fervour, because losing your fire could mean losing everything. Think about the organisational challenge that represents. Someone had to tend the fire constantly. Someone had to gather fuel, and during the volcanic winter, wood was scarce and often wet. They probably burned bone, dried grass, animal fat, anything that would produce heat. They developed techniques for keeping fires alive through days of wet weather or when fuel was impossible to find. The ability to maintain fire under these conditions required planning, cooperation, and probably ritual. Many anthropologists think this period is when fire maintenance became ceremonial in human cultures. Its heat was too important to leave to chance. It had to be protected by social rules, by designated firekeepers, by traditions that ensured the flames never died. Third, hunting. The megafauna that had once provided reliable food sources were dying off. The massive herds that our ancestors had followed for hundreds of thousands of years were gone, starved by the lack of vegetation or frozen by the impossible cold. But some animals survived, and the human survivors had to find them. The archaeological record shows something remarkable. Stone tools from the Toba period and immediately after become dramatically more sophisticated. We see the emergence of composite tools, weapons made from multiple materials carefully joined together. Spear points hafted with plant resin and sinew, creating weapons that were more deadly, more reliable, easier to repair. This wasn't gradual evolution of technology. This was rapid innovation under extreme pressure. When every hunt matters, when failure means your family starves, you get very good at making weapons that work. The survivors became master hunters, not because they were naturally gifted, but because the alternative was death. They also started hunting more strategically. Instead of following herds opportunistically, they learned to predict animal movements, to identify the few remaining areas where prey might concentrate. Water sources, salt licks, the rare patches of surviving vegetation. They learned to read landscapes in new ways, to think like the animals they hunted, and they learned to hunt cooperatively in ways that required unprecedented coordination. Taking down a mammoth or woolly rhino with stone-tipped spears requires perfect timing, strategic positioning, mutual trust. One person makes a mistake, and everyone dies. One person panics, and the hunt fails. The survivors developed coordination abilities that went far beyond anything their ancestors had achieved. Fourth, plant foods. When you think about human survival, hunting gets all the attention, but plant foods have always been the staple of human diets. The problem? During volcanic winter, plants died, but not all of them, not everywhere. The survivors became expert botanists. They learned to identify the few plant species that could survive low light and cold temperatures. They learned to exploit underground storage organs, roots and tubers that remained viable even when the surface vegetation died. They learned to process toxic plants that their ancestors had avoided, using fire and water to leach out poisons, expanding their edible food base. Archaeological sites show evidence of processing tools becoming more common. Grinding stones, pounding rocks, tools specifically designed to break down plant materials that couldn't be eaten raw. This suggests our ancestors were spending significant time and energy processing plants to extract every possible calorie. They were also probably storing food in ways that earlier humans hadn't bothered with. When resources are abundant, you don't need to plan for tomorrow. When every meal is uncertain, storage becomes survival. Evidence from this period suggests systematic food preservation, drying meat and fish, storing nuts and seeds, creating caches that could sustain a group through periods when hunting and gathering were impossible. But here's where it gets really interesting. All these survival adaptations, the cave management, the fire maintenance, the sophisticated hunting, the botanical knowledge, the food processing and storage, none of it works unless the group cooperates perfectly. This is where the bottleneck created its most profound evolutionary effect. Small group size meant everyone knew everyone. You couldn't hide, you couldn't slack off, you couldn't cheat, because if you did, the entire group could die, including you. Game theory researchers call this extreme cooperation under existential threat. When survival requires perfect coordination, natural selection favours individuals who are good at cooperating. People who share food, people who work well in teams, people who can communicate clearly and understand others, people who put group survival ahead of individual advantage. Those who were selfish, who hoarded resources or refused to cooperate, their groups died. They left no descendants. Those who worked together, who shared knowledge and resources, who developed strong social bonds, they survived. And they passed on not just their genes, but their cooperative behaviours to their children. This is when human psychology fundamentally changed. We became the most cooperative large-scale species on the planet. More cooperative than any other primate, more cooperative than pack hunters like wolves or killer whales. We developed an almost unique ability to work with non-relatives, to form coalitions with strangers, to coordinate activities across large groups, and it all started here, in these tiny refuge populations where perfect cooperation was the only path to survival. There's another element that most people don't consider: language. We talked about communication in the previous section, but the bottleneck period was probably when human language became truly sophisticated, truly modern. Think about the communication challenges these survivors faced. They needed to coordinate complex hunts. They needed to teach children elaborate skills, fire maintenance, tool making, plant identification, tracking techniques. They needed to share information about distant areas, where to find food, where dangers lurked, which water sources were still viable. They also needed to maintain social cohesion in extremely stressful conditions. When you're cold, hungry and terrified, social bonds break down easily. Conflicts arise over resources, over perceived fairness, over who's pulling their weight. Without sophisticated communication, these conflicts could tear groups apart. Language became the glue that held survivor groups together. The ability to explain, to persuade, to mediate conflicts, to tell stories that reinforced group identity and cooperation. Under these conditions, any improvement in language ability provided massive survival advantages. Individuals who could communicate more clearly, who could understand nuance, who could use language to strengthen social bonds, they helped their group survive. And over hundreds of generations, this selection pressure refined human language abilities far beyond what any other species had achieved. Some researchers think this is when humans developed the full suite of linguistic abilities we possess today. Grammar complex enough to express abstract concepts, vocabulary large enough to encode detailed technical knowledge, the cognitive flexibility to learn new words and concepts rapidly, the social intelligence to use language strategically, to build alliances, to teach, to lead. The survivors weren't just communicating anymore. They were talking, really talking, in ways that would be recognizable to modern humans. But perhaps the most important adaptation was psychological. The survivors developed what psychologists call stress tolerance and future-oriented thinking. They had to be able to function under constant pressure without breaking down. They had to be able to plan ahead, to delay gratification, to make decisions based on long-term consequences rather than immediate needs. This represents a massive shift in human cognition. Earlier humans, like most animals, lived largely in the present. They responded to immediate needs and opportunities. The bottleneck survivors had to think differently. They had to imagine future scenarios, plan for contingencies, make strategic decisions that might not pay off for weeks or months. The person who ate all the stored food today might be comfortable tonight, but their group would starve tomorrow. The person who maintained the fire even when they were exhausted ensured their family survived the next cold snap. The person who shared their kill, even when they were hungry, strengthened bonds that would save their life later. This future-oriented, strategic thinking became hardwired into human psychology. We became the species that plans, that imagines, that sacrifices now for benefits later. And it started as a survival adaptation during the darkest period in human history. The recovery was agonizingly slow. Even after the volcanic winter ended, after the skies cleared and temperatures began to rise, the world remained devastated. Ecosystems don't bounce back overnight. Forests take decades to regrow. Grasslands need years to recover. Animal populations, decimated by the die-off, required generations to rebuild. Archaeological evidence suggests the first few thousand years after Toba were almost as challenging as the volcanic winter itself. Resources remained scarce. Competition for what was available was fierce. Survivor populations remained small, probably never, more than a few hundred individuals in any given region. But something had changed in those survivors. The traits that had carried them through the crisis, the cooperation, the innovation, the communication abilities, the strategic thinking, these weren't temporary adaptations. They had become fundamental to human nature. And slowly, painfully, the population began to grow. Groups that had been confined to tiny refuges started exploring beyond their safe zones. They found that conditions, while still harsh, were improving. They found new areas with recovering resources. They began to spread. But they didn't spread randomly. The survivors passed down knowledge, traditions, survival techniques that had been refined during the crisis. Children learned from parents who had learned from grandparents who had lived through the darkness. This intergenerational knowledge transfer created cultural continuity that earlier humans had never achieved. Stone tool traditions that had developed during the bottleneck persisted for thousands of years. Hunting techniques that had been perfected under pressure continued to be used. Social structures that had emerged from cooperation requirements became standard. Even the psychological traits, the stress tolerance, the future thinking, the cooperative impulses, these were reinforced by culture and passed down through teaching as well as genes. By 60,000 years ago, when modern humans finally left Africa to encounter their evolutionary cousins, they carried with them all the adaptations that had emerged from the bottleneck. They were cooperation machines, innovation engines, communication experts. They could adapt to new environments rapidly, develop new technologies quickly, form large social networks easily. The Neanderthals and Denisovans they encountered were also descended from bottleneck survivors. They were also intelligent, cooperative, technologically sophisticated. But the African population, having remained in the climatically unstable homeland, having faced ongoing environmental challenges for another 10,000 years after their cousins had settled into stable European and Asian environments, had retained one crucial advantage: flexibility. When modern humans spread across the world, they brought with them the survivor mentality that had been forged in the fire of Toba. They encountered new environments and adapted. They faced new challenges and innovated. They met other human species, and while there was certainly conflict, they also cooperated enough to interbreed, to share knowledge, to sometimes coexist. But ultimately it was the descendants of those African refuge populations who prevailed. Not because they were stronger, not because they were naturally smarter, but because they carried in their genes and their culture the lessons of survival from humanity's darkest hour. Today, every human alive carries the genetic signature of that bottleneck. We all descend from those 280 survivors who refused to die. Their traits are our traits. Their adaptations are our inheritance. When you cooperate with strangers, that's the bottleneck survivor in you. When you plan for the future, that's the volcanic winter heritage. When you innovate, when you adapt, when you communicate, You're using abilities that were refined under the most extreme pressure our species has ever faced. The survivors didn't know they were shaping the future of humanity. They were just trying to get through another day, to keep their fires burning, to find enough food for their children, to maintain the social bonds that held their groups together. But in doing so, in refusing to give up even when the world ended around them, they created something unprecedented. They created us, modern humans, the species that survived the unsurvivable, adapted to the unadaptable, and eventually came to dominate an entire planet. We are all survivors, every single one of us. And the traits that saved our ancestors 70,000 years ago are still saving us today. The survivors didn't know they had survived something unprecedented. They couldn't know that their population had dropped to 10,000 individuals. They had no concept of genetic bottlenecks or extinction events. They just knew that the world had become impossibly hard, that their grandparents told stories of better times, that every day was a struggle against starvation and cold and darkness, but they kept going. And somehow, against odds that should have been insurmountable, those 10,000 people became 20,000, then 40,000, then 80,000. The recovery was slow, painfully slow. For thousands of years after Toba, human population growth remained barely above replacement level. Climate was still unstable. Resources were still scarce. The world Toba had created was a harsh teacher, and it wasn't done testing humanity yet. But something had changed in those survivors. The bottleneck hadn't just reduced their numbers, it had refined them, selected for the most adaptable, the most innovative, the most resilient traits in the human genome. Every person alive had descended from the small group that had managed to endure the worst environmental catastrophe in human history. They carried that legacy in their DNA, and they were about to use it to conquer the world. Around 60,000 years ago, about 10,000 years after the eruption, something remarkable happened. A small group of humans, maybe just a few hundred individuals, made a decision that would change everything. They left Africa. This wasn't the first time humans had ventured beyond the continent. Earlier populations of Homo erectus had spread into Asia and Europe millions of years before. But those earlier migrations had mostly failed or evolved into separate species like Neanderthals and Denisovans. This time would be different. The group that left Africa 60,000 years ago was carrying something their predecessors hadn't possessed. They were the refined product of the bottleneck, equipped with all the survival skills that had been so ruthlessly selected for during those desperate post-Toba millennia. Enhanced cognitive abilities, improved communication skills, technological innovation, and above all, unprecedented adaptability. They crossed into the Arabian Peninsula first. The climate had shifted just enough to create a narrow window of opportunity. Coastal routes that had been desert wastelands were now viable migration corridors. These pioneers followed the coastline, exploiting marine resources, gradually expanding their range. Within a few thousand years they had reached India, then Southeast Asia. By 50,000 years ago they were in Australia. Think about that. Australia. Getting there required sophisticated boat-building technology and navigation skills. It required planning, coordination, and the courage to sail into waters where no human had ever ventured. These weren't just survivors anymore. They were explorers, innovators, world conquerors in the making. Other groups headed north, into the Middle East and beyond. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans pushed into Europe in significant numbers. This is where they encountered their evolutionary cousins, the Neanderthals, who'd been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. The meeting between modern humans and Neanderthals is one of the most fascinating chapters in human history. For decades, scientists depicted it as a conflict, a violent replacement where superior modern humans wiped out their primitive cousins. But the genetic evidence tells a more nuanced story. They didn't just fight, they interbred. Today, if you're of non-African descent, about 2% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. That's the genetic signature of relationships formed between our species 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. Proof that when modern humans encountered other human species, at least sometimes, they saw not enemies, but potential partners. But cooperation has its limits, and here's where the story gets complicated, where the shadow of Toba still looms over human history. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations were already declining. By 30,000 years ago, they were restricted to a few refuges in southern Europe. By 28,000 years ago, they were gone entirely, extinct. Why? What happened to a species that had successfully survived in Europe for over 300,000 years? This is one of the biggest controversies in paleoanthropology, and Toba sits right at the heart of it. Some scientists argue that modern humans simply outcompeted Neanderthals through superior technology and organisation. We had more sophisticated tools, better hunting strategies, larger social networks. We could support bigger populations in the same territories. Over thousands of years, this demographic and technological advantage slowly pushed Neanderthals out of the best habitats until they had nowhere left to go. But others point to a darker possibility. What if Toba had already doomed the Neanderthals? Genetic analysis of Neanderthal DNA, extracted painstakingly from ancient bones, shows something disturbing. Their genetic diversity was even lower than modern humans, significantly lower. This suggests Neanderthal populations went through their own bottleneck, possibly even more severe than ours. When did this bottleneck occur? Right around 70,000 years ago. The same time as Toba. Here's the scenario. Toba erupts, plunging the world into volcanic winter. Human populations in Africa drop to 10,000 individuals, but Neanderthals in Europe, with smaller starting populations and less genetic diversity, get hit even harder. Maybe they drop to just a few thousand, maybe a few hundred. They survive. They recover, but they never fully bounce back. Their populations remain small, fragmented, genetically impoverished. They're walking wounded, an entire species weakened by a disaster they never fully recovered from. Then, 10,000 years later, modern humans show up. Not as conquerors necessarily, but as competitors with something Neanderthals had lost: demographic resilience, genetic diversity, the ability to recover quickly from setbacks. Under this scenario, modern humans didn't destroy Neanderthals. Toba did. We just filled the ecological space they could no longer hold. The same story might explain what happened to the Denisovans, the mysterious third human species that inhabited Asia. They also went extinct around the same time, absorbed into or replaced by expanding modern human populations. Their genetic diversity was also surprisingly low, consistent with a severe bottleneck around 70,000 years ago. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Some scientists now question whether Toba was actually as devastating as we've long believed. This debate has exploded in the last decade as new evidence has emerged. Archaeological sites from India, Southeast Asia and Africa show evidence of continuous human occupation right through the period of the eruption. Stone tools from before Toba look remarkably similar to tools from after Toba. There's no obvious break in the technological record, no sign of massive population collapse in the archaeological evidence. Some researchers argue that the genetic bottleneck signal we see in human DNA could have other explanations. Maybe it wasn't a single catastrophic event, but a longer period of population decline. Maybe it was caused by other factors entirely, like disease or competition between human groups. Climate data from this period is also being re-evaluated. Some ice core samples show the volcanic winter might have been shorter and less severe than originally thought. Regional climate models suggest Africa, where most humans lived, might have been partially shielded from the worst effects. There's even a controversial theory that the genetic bottleneck predates Toba by tens of thousands of years. The human populations were already declining before the volcano erupted. So what's the truth? Did Toba almost end humanity? Or is it just a convenient scapegoat for population changes that were already underway? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain. The evidence is fragmentary, often contradictory, subject to multiple interpretations. Scientists are still arguing about it in academic journals and conferences. New data emerges every year that either supports or challenges the Toba catastrophe hypothesis. But here's what we can say with confidence. Something happened to humanity around 70,000 years ago. Something reduced our genetic diversity to levels that should have led to extinction. Whether it was Toba specifically, or a combination of factors, humans went through a bottleneck so severe that it left permanent marks in our DNA. And somehow, we survived. That survival is written in every person alive today. If you trace your ancestry back far enough, you'll find you're descended from that tiny population of survivors. All of us, every human on Earth, carries the genetic legacy of that near-extinction event. Think about what that means. Every person you've ever met, every human who has ever lived in recorded history, everyone who built the pyramids or wrote Shakespeare or landed on the moon, all descended from maybe 1,780 breeding pairs who managed to survive the worst climate disaster in human history. We are all, every single one of us, the children of survivors. And that heritage shaped us in profound ways. The bottleneck didn't just reduce our population, it refined our species, selected for traits that would prove crucial to our eventual dominance of the planet. The survivors needed to be adaptable. Conditions changed constantly in the post-Toba world. Groups that could modify their strategies, exploit new food sources, adjust to shifting climates had better chances of survival. Over thousands of generations, this pressure selected for cognitive flexibility, the ability to think creatively and solve novel problems. They needed to cooperate. Small populations couldn't afford internal conflict. Groups that worked together, shared resources, maintained social cohesion survived. Those that didn't disappeared. This selected for enhanced social cognition, the ability to read intentions, build relationships, maintain complex social networks. They needed to communicate. Survival knowledge had to be passed between generations with perfect accuracy. Hunting strategies, tool-making techniques, information about resources and dangers all had to be transmitted reliably. This created intense pressure for the development of sophisticated language. They needed to innovate. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. Groups that could develop new technologies, new survival strategies, new ways of exploiting their environment had advantages. This selected for creativity, experimentation, the willingness to try unprecedented solutions to unprecedented problems. All of these traits, refined in the crucible of near extinction, became the foundation of human success. When modern humans finally began expanding across the globe, they carried with them a toolkit of cognitive and social abilities that no other species could match. The migration out of Africa 60,000 years ago was just the beginning. Within 15,000 years, humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. By 15,000 years ago, we had developed agriculture. By 10,000 years ago, we were building cities. By 5,000 years ago, we had invented writing. The pace of change accelerated exponentially. Technologies that took hundreds of thousands of years to develop during the pre-bottleneck period now emerged in mere millennia. Stone tools gave way to bronze, then iron, then steel. Nomadic bands became agricultural villages, then towns, then cities, then empires. Population growth followed a similar trajectory. By 10,000 years ago, around the dawn of agriculture, the world population had reached maybe 5 million people. Still tiny by modern standards, but 500 times larger than the post-Toba bottleneck population. By 5,000 years ago, there were maybe 50 million humans. By 2,000 years ago, 300 million. By 1800 CE, 1 billion. Today, over 8 billion, That's 800,000 times larger than the bottleneck population, from 10,000 to 8 billion in 70,000 years. But this explosive success raises uncomfortable questions. If we nearly went extinct once, could it happen again? The threats we face today are different from Toba, but potentially just as deadly. Climate change, driven not by volcanoes, but by our own carbon emissions, threatens to destabilise agricultural systems that support billions of people. Nuclear weapons, products of the same technological innovation that saved us from extinction, now possess the capacity to end civilization in hours. Pandemics, like the one we've recently experienced, demonstrate how vulnerable our interconnected global society has become. A pathogen that might have threatened only a single band of hunter-gatherers 70,000 years ago can now spread worldwide in weeks. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nanotechnology, all present both enormous opportunities and existential risks that our ancestors never had to consider. Are we more resilient now than we were 70,000 years ago? Or more fragile? In some ways, we're incredibly resilient. We have technology that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We have scientific knowledge that lets us predict and prepare for dangers. We have global communication networks that can coordinate responses to threats. We have, quite literally, the accumulated wisdom of 70,000 years of survival. But in other ways, we've become dangerously fragile. Our agricultural systems depend on stable climate patterns. Our economies require constant growth and resource extraction. Our technology requires complex global supply chains. Our population of 8 billion needs an astonishing amount of food, water and energy every single day. A disaster that would have killed 90% of a hunter-gatherer population might kill 99% of modern civilization. Not because we're less capable as individuals, but because our systems are so complex and interconnected that catastrophic failure could cascade in unprecedented ways. The bottleneck taught our ancestors a crucial lesson. Survival requires adaptability. When the world changes, you change with it, or you die. The question is whether modern humanity retains that flexibility, or whether we've become locked into systems too rigid to survive another genuine crisis. But here's something worth considering. Those 10,000 people who survived Toba didn't have any advantages we lack. They had no technology beyond stone tools and fire, no scientific understanding of what was happening to them, no global coordination or emergency response systems. What they had was something simpler and more powerful, the refusal to give up. Generation after generation, in the face of conditions that should have killed them, they adapted, innovated, cooperated, and survived. They didn't do it because they were trying to save humanity. They probably didn't even conceive of humanity as a concept. They did it because they wanted their children to live, because they loved each other, because surrender wasn't in their nature. That same stubborn resilience exists in us. It's our inheritance, written into our genes by 117,000 years of natural selection, during and after the bottleneck. We are the descendants of people who survived the unsurvivable, who looked at a world turned to ash and darkness and decided to keep going anyway, who lost everything except each other and decided that was enough. Every challenge humanity has overcome since then, from ice ages to plagues to wars to famines, we've overcome because we carry that legacy. We are the children of the 10,000, the heirs of the bottleneck survivors. The story of Toba, whether or not it's as dramatic as we once thought, teaches us something profound about our place in Earth's timeline. We're not the inevitable result of billions of years of evolution. We're the improbable survivors of countless close calls, a species that should probably be extinct multiple times over, but somehow keeps persisting. Our existence is contingent, fragile. If that small population 70,000 years ago had made different choices, if climate had been slightly worse, if resources had been slightly scarcer, you wouldn't be here. None of us would. Some other species might have evolved to dominate Earth. Or maybe none would have, but they didn't fail. They survived. And because they survived, we exist. We exist because 10,000 people refused to give up 70,000 years ago. Because they adapted when adaptation seemed impossible. Because they cooperated when conflict would have been easier. Because they innovated when tradition was failing. Because they loved their children enough to fight for a future they would never see. That's who we are. That's where we come from. The children of survivors, carrying the genetic and cultural legacy of the greatest comeback in human history, from 10,000 to 8 billion. From the edge of extinction to the dominant species on the planet, from scattered bands of desperate survivors to a civilization that has reached the moon and is planning missions to Mars. It's the most improbable success story in the history of life on Earth, and it started with people not so different from us, facing odds not so different from the ones we face now, choosing survival when extinction seemed inevitable. The question is, can we do it again if we have to? So let's pause for a moment and really think about what this means. What you've just heard isn't ancient history in some abstract sense. This is your story, your personal origin story. Every single person watching this video, everyone listening as they drift off to sleep tonight, you all descend from those 180 survivors who refused to give up when the world turned against them. Their genes are your genes. Their resilience is coded into your DNA. That fused chromosome that marks you as human, that's the signature of the bottleneck. Proof that you come from a lineage that faced literal extinction, and somehow, impossibly, survived. Think about the journey. 70,000 years ago, your ancestors huddled in caves and coastal refuges, while volcanic winter turned the world into a frozen wasteland. They watched their friends and family die. They saw their population crash from tens of thousands to barely more than 1,000 individuals. For 117,000 years, give or take, they lived on the edge. Every generation wondering if they'd be the last. Every child born a small miracle against overwhelming odds. But they didn't just survive, they thrived. They split into 3 distinct human species, each one perfecting different survival strategies. They spread across 3 continents. They developed technology, language, culture, art. They created the first systematic hunting techniques, the first burial practices, the first trade networks. They were building the foundations of civilization while still living in caves. Then came the competition. The 3 human species encountered each other and had to decide whether to cooperate or compete. They did both. They interbred, sharing survival genes that are still helping people live at extreme altitudes today. They fought, competing for the same resources in a world that was still recovering from catastrophe. And eventually one species, your species, developed the flexibility and adaptability to outlast the others. Not because modern humans were stronger. Neanderthals could bench press a modern human into oblivion. Not because we were smarter. Neanderthal brains were actually larger. We won because we were more adaptable. Because the ongoing environmental instability in Africa had kept us evolutionarily flexible. Because the bottleneck had selected for innovation, cooperation, and the ability to change tactics when circumstances changed. From those 1,280 individuals, humanity grew. 10,000 survivors after the immediate crisis, 100,000 a few thousand years later, millions by the time agriculture was invented. Today, 8 billion people walking this planet, every single one carrying the genetic signature of the bottleneck, every single one descended from ancestors who looked extinction in the face and decided that giving up wasn't an option. But here's what really gets me. Here's what keeps me awake at night thinking about this story. Those people didn't know they were saving humanity. They didn't have some grand mission to preserve the species for future generations. They were just trying to survive one more day, find food for their children, keep the fire burning through another cold night, make it to the next season. They did what humans have always done. They adapted, they innovated, they took care of each other, and somehow that was enough. So now I want you to think about something. Really imagine yourself in their position. You're living 70,000 years ago. The sun has disappeared behind a veil of volcanic ash. The temperature has dropped 15 degrees. Animals are dying, plants are withering, your group is starving. What would you have done? Would you have kept going when everything seemed hopeless? Would you have figured out how to catch fish when the land animals disappeared? Would you have shared your last scrap of food with someone else's child? I like to think I would have. I like to think that same survivor's instinct is still there in all of us. Because here's the thing, we might need it again. Could we survive another Toba-scale event today? We have technology our ancestors couldn't dream of. Climate-controlled buildings, global supply chains, satellite communication, agricultural science that can grow food in deserts. But we also have 8 billion people to feed instead of 10,000. We've specialised and optimised our systems for efficiency, not flexibility. We depend on infrastructure that's incredibly fragile when you really examine it. A week without power, a month without fuel, a year without reliable growing seasons. How would modern civilization handle it? Would our technology save us, or would our dependence on that technology doom us? I don't have answers to these questions, but I think they're worth asking. Because the story of the bottleneck isn't just about the past. It's about resilience. It's about the incredible human capacity to face impossible challenges and somehow find a way forward. Your ancestors did it with stone tools and fire. They did it with nothing but their intelligence, their cooperation, and their absolute refusal to give up. That same capacity lives in you. That same resilience is coded into your DNA. You are the product of the greatest survival story ever told. So if you found this story as fascinating as I do, if learning about humanity's brush with extinction has changed how you see yourself and your place in history, do me a favour. Hit that like button. Help other people discover this incredible story. And leave a comment. I want to know where you're listening from tonight. What part of the world? What time is it where you are? Are you in Africa, where your ancestors survived the worst of the volcanic winter? Europe, where Neanderthals once roamed? Asia, home of the mysterious Denisovans? Or somewhere else entirely? And tell me honestly, will you look at humanity differently after hearing this? Will you see that stranger on the street and think, we share the same survivor ancestors? If you want more stories like this, deep dives into the forgotten moments that shaped our species, the hidden turning points that made us who we are, subscribe to the channel. Because there are so many more stories to tell. Times when everything hung in the balance, and somehow we made it through. The bottleneck survivors didn't know if humanity would survive, but they kept going anyway. They faced the absolute worst that nature could throw at them. They endured 117,000 years on the edge of extinction. They rebuilt from populations so small that every person you meet today is essentially your distant cousin. If they could survive that, if they could face volcanic winter and genetic near collapse and still build the foundation for 8 billion descendants, then maybe, just maybe, we can face whatever challenges come next. Sleep well tonight knowing you come from survivors, knowing that no matter what happened today, no matter what challenges you're facing, you carry the genes of people who refuse to give up when giving up would have been so much easier. You're a bottleneck survivor's descendant, and that means something. That means everything.